Hello everyone, in this video I want to give you an overview over how an oTree project looks like and what the different files and folders do. As you can see, I've opened an oTree project here in PyCharm, and if you don't know how to start a new oTree project yet, you should check out the previous video in this tutorial series. But before we go into look at this in detail, let's talk a little bit about the structure of oTree in general. So oTree is separated into kind of two structures. We have projects and you have apps within the project. And one app could be one experiment or one part of the experiment that you're running, and the project is kind of a collection of different apps. For example, let's say you want to run an experiment where subjects first need to do a prisoner's dilemma and afterwards they play a hide and seek game. Then you would create an oTree project for your experiment, and inside this project you would create two apps, one app for the prisoner's dilemma and one app for the hide and seek game. And then later on you're going to combine these two apps into one session and run both of them sequentially in your real experiment. So an app is kind of one experiment, and the project is a container of different experiments that you want to run together potentially. But how you structure your project into apps is a bit up to you. So it would be perfectly possible to have a project where you have both a hide and seek game and a prisoner's dilemma and just have it inside of one app. But if you use different apps, then it makes it much easier for you to reuse your code. For example, let's say later on you want to run a different experiment where you also need a prisoner's dilemma, but you don't need the hide and seek game. If you have separated the things into the different apps, then you could just copy the prisoner's dilemma outside of your old project and everything would run immediately. So now that we have this set, let's take a little bit of a look at how this project looks like. So here we have two folders called statics and templates. And in the static folder we can store things like images or sounds or videos if we need them in our experiment. In the templates folder we can design how our web pages should look like. And these two folders here, you can see they are on the project level, so they are not on the app level, which means they are kind of global settings for all your projects. So if you want a specific style to be applied to all your websites in all of your apps, you might want to put it here inside the templates folder. But let's say if your prisoner's dilemma and your hide and seek game should have different kind of styling, you would have another template folder inside of the app and you would put things inside of this folder. Then the next important thing that we can see is a settings.py file. And in this file you can just change some global settings. For example, you can change the language, you can change the currency, you can change whether you want to use the actual currency or you want to use a currency called points during the experiment, which is then later on going to be converted into your actual currency. And you can change some things about the admin interface. And finally here in the sessions config list here, you actually have to put all the apps that you want to use inside of this session.config. So later on when you create a new app, for example prisoner's dilemma, it will need to go into this session.config file. And finally here we have a folder called overview app, and this folder is one app that I have created. But before we're gonna look at this, let's learn how to start a new app and take a look at how an empty, freshly created oTree app looks like. So to do this, I have opened the terminal down here, and first of all I need to navigate into my project folder. My project folder is called oTree tutorial. So I made a spelling mistake here. It's called oTree tutorial. I'm gonna navigate to this folder, and then I'm gonna create a new app with the command oTree start app, and then whatever I want to name the app, I'm gonna call it test app for now. And so now we've created this new app, and in a couple of seconds PyCharm will also recognize it, and it should show up here inside the PyCharm main directory if you're using PyCharm. Yeah, so here it is, test app. So we're going to open it, and inside of an app we have a couple of files, and the important files here are the pages.py, the models.py, And here we have the templates folder, and as I already mentioned, you have another templates folder in the global settings, and here inside this app templates folder, you put the actual pages that your subjects are going to see, and you also put styling that is separate just for this experiment or for this page here, because you would put it inside of these files directly. So let's take a look at the first file. The first file, the pages.py. What this file does is, here you put all the code that is linked to one specific page. So when your subject goes through an experiment, maybe on the first page they would see the instructions, and on the second page they would play the actual experiment, and then on the third page they would see the results. In this case, you would need 3 classes in here inside of this pages.py file, and the first one would be called instructions, second one would be called prisoner's dilemma, for example, and the third one would be called results. And here you would put Python code that is related to one specific page, and later on we're going to take a look at what kind of things you would want to put here. Then the next thing is the models.py file, and here you can store things that you're going to need throughout the experiment. So there's 4 different classes in here, and the 2 most important ones are this one, the constants, and the players class. So here in the constants class, you would have a couple of configuration things already set for you. So for example, you would have the number of rounds set here. You'd have players per group. None means that it's a single player game, and if you would have a game where, like, say, a prisoner's dilemma where 2 people interact, you would put 2 in here. And then this is a name and URL, which is something that you don't need to worry about. And here you could put other things that are, like the class suggests, constant throughout the experiment. For example, if you have a prisoner's dilemma, then there would be different payoffs that would be the same for all players. So let's say if both players cooperate, they both get a payoff of 4. And then you could put payoff equals 4 in here as a constant. And this would then be something that you could use throughout the app every time you need to know what the payoff of the subjects are supposed to be. And finally, down here in the players class, here you're going to store the information that the players enter throughout the experiment. So for example, if the players have some choices, you could store which choice they made in here. And we're going to look at this later on, how this works. And finally, next important thing, we have here the templates. So inside the folder templates, and then name of your app, in my case test app, there's a templates file, and this is where we design the how the user interface looks like. So everything we kind of can see in here is displayed to the user right now. It says block title, page title. So if I would open this page as the user, I would see page title written in here. And here in block content, this is where the main part of your content should be. If I would type hello in here, then directly hello would be displayed to the subject that opens this page. And you can also see a couple of things here in curly brackets. This is part of the oTree template language. For example, this thing here kind of defines that everything in here is a title, so it will be displayed in a larger font size and in bold. And this here is a next button, which, like the name suggests, gets the user to the next page. And we're going to look at this in more detail later on. So now we have an overview over how a new empty oTree app looks like and what the files are generally used for. And now let's take a look at an app where I have already put a little bit of code, so we can see how we can change these files to actually get an experiment that does something. And let's maybe start with the models.py. So here I have added a couple of things in the constants. So in the constants, you can just create new Python variables, which you want to use later on. For example, here I have a variable called randomized question order, and I've set it to true. And this means that later on, if I were to implement a randomization of a question order that checks whether this variable is true or false, then I could easily switch on and off question order randomization depending on whether I need it or not. But so I still need to implement this. It's not just by typing randomizing question order equals true. Actually, I get randomized question order. I would need to implement this myself. Then I have a list of questions here that I want to ask the subjects. And again, are just the labels. Later on, I would need to implement myself what these questions do. Then and finally, I have something that's called a currency field with the base payment in it, where I have this little C in here. So C means currency, and that means that, for example, if I add something here to the player's payoff from the experiment and I display it to them, it will automatically be formatted correctly in the file. So if my currency is dollar, then they would see not just the number but also the dollar sign. So that's why I might want to use this currency function. So whenever you have currencies, wrap them with a C and the round brackets. And again, this is kind of things that I can use for all my subjects. And then down here in the players class, I'm going to store some information. And there are different types of what we call fields in oTree in which we can store information. So I have an example of all the fields that oTree supports in here. So first of all, we have a Boolean field. If you followed a little bit of a Python tutorial, you would know that Boolean is the same as we have shown here, is a value that is either true or false. So it can have an answer to a yes/no question. And here I created a Boolean field called it in treatment group, where, for example, if I have, usually if you run an experiment, you're going to have treatments. And in this case, if I just have 2 treatments, I could create a field, call it in treatment group. And then later on, I'm going to store the information for each individual participant, whether this participant is in the treatment group or not. And then during experiment, I can retrieve this information and display them the right kind of questions, depending on whether they are in the treatment group or not. So this is a Boolean field. Then a string field. Strings are used to store texts. So for example, if a subject has a specific label, let's say one subject is called the hider in a hide and seek game, and one subject is called the seeker in a hide and seek game, and I want to store the information whether the subject is the hider or the seeker, I could store it in the string field. Or here I chose just an ID that is some sort of text that is unique to any player. Then the next one is a long string field, which has exactly the same functionality with 2 differences. The first one is just that you could put more text in it. So there is a limit to how much text you can put into a normal string field. And the second one is the way it is displayed. So if I'm going to use this for a user input and I'm going to ask the user for feedback and I have the type long string field, they're going to see quite a large text box on their screen where they can input a lot of text. Whereas if I would use a normal string field, they would just see one line of a text box, which might be suited for some circumstance. For example, if you want them to enter their name, but not if you want them to enter feedback. And then integer fields are for whole numbers. So if I want to store something that is a whole number, I would use an integer field. And here I have an example, for example, number option chosen. Let's say you give a subject a choice and they have 2 choices, so you could store 1 if they choose option 1 and 2 if they choose option 2 in here. Then the next one is a float field, and float fields are for decimals. For example, like if you have an experiment that involves some kind of stock market trading with different assets, and the asset would have a price, and the price wouldn't be a whole number, it would be a decimal number, so you would store it in a float field. And then again, currency field. So similar as here with the C and the constants class, C and the base payment, a currency field is meant to store payoffs. So if you want to give your subject a payoff for completing a task, you would store it in a currency field. But you might not want to create your own currency field because oTree already has an internal currency field called payoff that you can use, and we're going to learn how to do this later on. So you only need to create a new currency field. For example, if you want to store different payoffs from different tasks separately, then you would want to create your own currency fields. So this is an overview over the models. Now let's take a look at what the pages do. So here in this this experiment, I just have 2 sites, 2 pages. You can also see each page in here has a corresponding template down here in the templates folder. And I have my page and I have results, which are the standard pages that oTree creates. And here in the my page, I've implemented a couple of things to show you the functionality of this page class. So first of all, we have form model and form fields down here, and those are for user input. So as you as you might remember, if I open the models page again, here we have created a lot of fields where we could store information. And one of these fields here is called number option chosen, which you can see here, this is this one, which means that on my page, we expect the user to make an input and tell us which option they want to choose, but we don't want them to input any of the other information that we have created fields for. We would want them to do that on different pages, or we might want to do it internally without direct user input. And here I have four models. This is player, and that is because down here I stored all this information in a class called player because it's unique to each player. If I would have a multiplayer experiment and there would be some information that is not unique to each player but that is shared by the entire group, for example, you have an experiment where everyone needs to contribute something to a common good and you want to store how much the group in total contributed, then you would store this here in the group class. And if you want to let someone make a user input that is valid for the entire group, then you would put form model equals group here. But in almost any experiment, you would leave this at player and then just select the fields that you want down here. And if you would want multiple user inputs on the same page, you would just put a comma here and then after the comma put the second field that they are supposed to input. So then besides this, so this is handling user input, there are three standard methods that you can implement in each field class for oTree. And the first one is called isDisplayed, so you add it with typing def isDisplayed self colon. And what this one does, this one decides if this page is supposed to be displayed in a given round. For example, if you have an experiment where subjects do the same tasks for 10 rounds in a row, and you have instructions, then you probably only want to display the instructions in the first round, and after the first round they just repeat the task. And you would implement something like this with this def isDisplayed function. And basically what this does is if you return true here, then the page is displayed, and if you return false, then the page is not displayed. And by default, this always returns true, so if I would delete this thing, this would mean that the page is shown. But right here, I want a page that is only shown in the first round. So I'm using an if here. I check if the round number equals 1. And if this is true, then I return true. And if this is not the case, then I return false. So this would make sure that this page is only displayed in round 1. And as you can see here, we are using self.roundNumber here and not just round number, because this page, this my page, could be called in different rounds. So we need to kind of tell it that it's not going to supposed to use the round number of itself, so of the page that we currently see, because this code, a copy of this code is created for every single round, and by using self here we are telling it to use the copy that is currently active, so the correct page for the current round. Then the next thing that we can do in the pages class is we can do something before next page, and as the name says, this happens before the next page is started. So for example, if we have a user input, and then depending on what the user, the choice that the user made, we want to give them a payoff, then we could use this def before next page function, read their user input, and then vary their payoff accordingly. But for simplicity, I've just done a version here where we set the payoff of the player to 5 after the page is over. So as soon as the subject clicks next on my page, they get a payoff of 5 for answering the question on my page. And as you can see here again, I'm again using self, and now I'm using self.player. And why is this so? So self refers to the page again, but the information about the payoff is not supposed to be related to the page, it's related to the player. So we need to tell the page that it's supposed to link us to the player that is currently open this page. So again, for example, if we have 3 subjects running the experiment, each one of them would see this page, and by typing self.player, we are going to tell the page that it's supposed to store information for the player that is just opening the page. So for player 1, this will store information in the field that is related to player 1, and for player 2 in the field that is related to player 2, and so on. And finally, we have vars for template. And this is if we want to display something to the user. For example, here, let's assume this was the last page and we want to display them a completion code, which they can then later on send us via email or post into an online form or whatever to let us know that they have completed the experiment and we are supposed to pay them. Then I could generate a completion code here in Python and then return it here, and that would allow me to display it to the user in the HTML page down here that I have here. And right now I'm just returning a fixed code, but I could, for example, use Python to randomly generate a code and then display a randomly generated code that is different for every single subject that opens this page. But for now, we're just gonna return this code here. And then finally, the last thing that we can take a look at is how does the page look like. So on the page, we have these things on top, the extents and the load. This is automatically generated for you and you don't need to worry about it for now. And we have this block. And in this block called content, we put our main content for our website. And the first thing that we have in here is called form fields. What that does is it kind of looks for which user input we want on this field, and then it generates an input box where the subjects could enter the input. So right now here on the pages.py, we told our my page that the form fields is number option chosen. And by calling this, we will make sure that when the subject opens this page, they have a field in where they can input which number they want to choose. But if we would have multiple options, let's say we would also have the feedback enabled and we would have put comma and then feedback in here, then it would display both. So we would get a field where subjects can enter the numerical input and would get a field where subjects could enter the feedback. And there are also ways to decide which kind of form field is supposed to be displayed where. So right now with this method, all the input fields would just be displayed below each other at the beginning of the page. But later on, we are also going to learn how to just display the number input down here and then have a couple of other things and then have the feedback box maybe down here. And the next thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to display some things. And here I'm going to display the completion code. So as you can remember, we returned this completion code here in the pages.py. And so this part is just normal HTML text. So this will just be displayed. So the subject will see completion code and then colon. But this part in the double curly brackets, this tells oTree that this is not a text, so it's not going to display completion underscore code here, but it's going to replace this with whatever the variable completion underscore code that we returned in the vars for template looks like. So here we returned this code JH something. So when the subject opens this page, they're going to see completion code colon JH something, and not this curly brackets. And down here we can see that we can not only return things that we defined in the vars for template, but we can also use anything that we have stored in our models.py page. So here, if we go back to our models.py and the constants, there was a field called base payment, which was a currency of value of 1. And by using the curly brackets again, but now typing constants dot before the name, so constants dot base payment instead of just base payment, oTree knows it's supposed to look for something that is in the models.py file and specifically in the constant class down there, and not something that is returned in the vars for template. So this way we can display things we stored in the constants. And we could do the same with player. Note the main difference here: if we want to return something on the player model, for example, we want to return the player their ID, then we would type player.player underscore ID down here, but the player would be lowercase, so constant is uppercase, player would be lowercase. And then finally down here we have some text, so it's called hello world, which I just display to the user. And remember, anything we just type in here without any curly brackets or anything around it is directly displayed to the user, like the way we type it down here. And finally, we have a next button. So this is going to display a button where the subject can click on, and then they're going to go to the next page. And another thing that we have in here is comments. So as you can see here, we have this curly bracket percent sign and then comment, and then here was end comment. So anything we write in here is just for us. So we can write anything in here to kind of keep our code organized and remember what we want to do. So here it says a table in HTML, which would hint that we would want to display a table down here. I haven't actually implemented this in this code, but let's say I would want to display the subject as a table, and I would put the code for a table down here, and later on I want to remember what I did. I could put this comment here so that when I read the code again, I remember, okay, what follows after this is going to display a table to the subject. So this was a very fast overview over all the different files in oTree, and we're gonna, in the next tutorials, we are gonna learn how to actually develop some experiments from scratch, and then we're gonna revisit many of the things we've seen in this tutorial in a much slower pace. So if you feel this was a bit fast right now, don't be worried, it will all come up again in a slower pace. But I think it's still good to have kind of an overview over all the different things that you can do in an oTree project. And the last thing that we want to do now is we want to look at this app that we have created here and see what it actually does. And for this, we are going to open a development server. So we're going to type oTree dev server. And then we need to switch into Firefox. Okay, now we are in Firefox here at the address localhost :8000 and then /demo, but you don't have to type the /demo, that is added automatically when you type localhost :8000. And we can see here we have our overview app, and as you might notice, we don't have the test app here that we have created at the beginning of the tutorial, and that is because I didn't add it in the settings.py file where I added the overview app. So we're going to click on this now. This is the oTree admin interface, and now we have created a session for this app, and we can start to initialize the player by clicking on this link. And as you can see, we have the number option chosen and an input field where we can input numbers. We have the completion code that we displayed here. We have the base payment, and it says 1 point here because we used the currency method and we enabled the usage of coins instead of dollars. And we have our text hello world, which we just typed out here, and the next button. And if we click on next now, we get to the results page where we didn't actually implement anything. But what we can see is if we go back to this tab, we can actually look at the data, and we can see that here the number option chosen is 23, which is what I entered on the previous page. So we can see that oTree records the option that we have chosen. And as you can see, it also recorded that the payoff is 5, even though we didn't let the user input that because we set this payoff in the method before next page. So our data is stored correctly. And that was it for this tutorial, and I hope to see you in the next one.